My name is John Bailey. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm the Executive Director of Digital Learning Now. We have a great panel, short amount of time, and a very sort of big topic about the nuclear option. This is the North Korea option. Should we blow it up, the current system, or start from scratch? And we'll talk a little bit about that. We have a great panel. I just want to introduce them very quickly. To my right, we have John Chubb, who's the incoming president of the National Association of Independent Schools. He's the founder of Leeds Global Partners and former CEO of Edison Learning. To his right, we have John Danner, Chief Executive Officer, Next Gen Consumer, and co-founder of Rocketship Schools, Rocketship Education. We also have Ben Rayer, founder and Chief Executive Officer of Touchstone Education. And then Linda Zecker from Houghton Mifflin was supposed to join us, but because of the tragedy yesterday in Boston, she felt it was appropriate, and we definitely agree for her to go back. Their offices were very close to kind of where the events unfolded. And joining us in her place is John Dragoon, who's the Chief Marketing Officer and Executive Vice President of Houghton Mifflin. So my job is just going to help to facilitate and hopefully control and contain what's going to be a very sort of exciting conversation. And it is really to sort of dive into this whole notion of, technology and online challenges current models, challenges current models of governance, challenges current models of shopping, challenges current models of education. And that can be very threatening. It can be very disorienting. It challenges long-held assumptions, structures, systems, and policies. And so the question really before us today is, can the system evolve to catch up and accommodate those changes, harness those opportunities, and really advance education? Or is that even possible? Can we do that from the system that we have now? Or as the sort of title suggests, we have to sort of blow up the system and start from scratch? And so I think I'm just going to start with just one sort of fundamental question for the panel. But sort of a game changer for education is technology. So it has the potential to completely revolutionize the way we deliver instruction, the way we empower parents and teachers. So can it really change education? Will it or won't it? What's the opportunity, and what's holding that sort of change and transformation back?
I'm happy to start.
All right.
Inevitably, technology will change education. The question is, how long will it take? If education were a traditional market-based enterprise, it would find its way into smaller firms as it brought about efficiencies, as it brought about better opportunities for learners, for students, because we have a system that is government-controlled or mixed. With charter schools providing some competition, with independent schools providing some competition. There are market pressures that will help to drive this, and over the last 20 years we've seen it accelerate as the rules have changed. But I think that the key factor is whether the rules that our political leaders, particularly in the states, set, whether those are changed in a timely way. John mentioned that there's threats, there's job issues, very serious job issues that creates the political opposition, and that's really I think is the linchpin for the current period.
And I guess I would say that technology already changed learning, we just didn't notice. So we tend to think of education as the thing that institutions do, but if you step back and you say that learning is what kids do, giving technology directly to children does allow them to learn in a way that maybe we weren't very good at institutions. I want to give you a statistic from Rocketship. In June of 2012, 25% of our parents had smartphones. This is the lowest income people in San Jose in general, 92% poverty at our school. So 25% had smartphones in June of 2012. We looked again in January of 2013, and it was up to 70%. Okay, so 3 times more people now are directly connected to the internet. I asked several teachers, what are we going to do about the other 30%? And they said, it's been growing 5 or 10% a month. Don't worry about it. By the end of the year, everybody will be online. So if you think about that, that is the macro change in learning. It is not, what we're doing in institutions. It's the fact that now every student can learn directly. And I think the challenge for us in the institutional setting is, what do we do about that? How do we work with that and benefit from that, as opposed to resist that or work against that? And I think that if you're trying to create a pure consumer learning company, that's very difficult. Anybody who's tried to put an app in the App Store and compete against the other 70,000 people that want to beat you every day. That's not a very easy business. If you want to sell products to schools, that's not a very easy business. So the question is, how do you put these two things together so that teachers can recommend products to parents, parents can use products? There's just a conjunction of these two things that I think is going to be the answer in the next few years.
Well, good morning. Good afternoon, I guess now. I think it's a bit of a false choice, actually. I think you don't begin with technology as the conversation. It's the means to the end. So I certainly agree with you, John, that it's changed. For us, it's interesting. We're a 180-year-old publisher. One would think we're actually resistant to change. It's quite the contrary. 70% of what we do is digital and growing every day. But we see the big gating factor to it is actually in the professional development and education side, helping people, schools, districts, administrators, teachers, students, and parents learn how to leverage technology on behalf of the outcomes that we all want to create. So it turns out that the platform itself is not the gating factor, but it's the education and knowledge to how to leverage said platform and the technology on behalf of the change that we're all seeking. And I think that's one area, frankly, we're underinvested in or underestimating the change management required to implement, just as every industry is embedded technology, the change management required to take advantage of what technology allows for. So I think that's one of the areas that all of us could focus on.
I don't have a lot to add. I would just echo what John said, though. So Rocketships, West Coast, San Jose, our schools, Touchstone, Newark, New Jersey, very, very different environment, 100% minority, 90% poor. And the percentage of families that have internet access in that environment, 70% of our families. Blew me away. And then I realized it's sort of like the TV of our generation is what I realized. Because the number of families that have computers to use to do work that we have students able to do if they could do it was 50. So I still thought that was a remarkable number. And then I started running around doing an elevator pitch about what we're doing all the time, and I think everybody else said it really well. It's already happened. I run around telling people, we still run school pretty much today, private school, public school, charter school, the way we did 100 years ago. And yet the world has completely changed in the past 10 years, and maybe even just in the past 2 or 3. So we're either going to figure out how to catch up or the kids are going to demand it from us, and we see that. Just a quick another anecdote. We had a child, we have middle schoolers, who was struggling with his typing, and he asked if I could just use my thumbs, like pick up his computer, right? We have these MacBook Airs. If I could use my thumbs, I could do it faster for you, which was, I'm like, what are you talking about? What he meant was, like the rest, all of you in here, I could see some of you doing it now. You're texting, right? So that was what he was most comfortable typing with. He could move the fastest by using his thumbs. It was remarkable.
I realize we have 3 Johns up here too, so this is but I realize John Danner had a provocative question that sort of go along these lines about transformation, about sort of institutions. We sort of think about institutions as where learning takes place, but John Chubb and I were on a panel a couple weeks ago. We started talking about, one of the big issues now is sort of bring your own device. What happens when kids start showing up to schools with smartphones? But we started wondering what is the next wave actually, what happens when kids start showing up with their own learning? Do we have a system that's ready for students that go and independently take a MOOC course or go and take SalCon courses or show up with badges as part of Mozilla's Open Badge initiative? What happens then when sort of students are coming to education institutions with these new types of credentials, with these new types of certificates, with badges, with other sort of forms of learning that they've encountered in libraries, museums, and just other sort of places outside of school? And just what does that mean for us in the education sort of system generally?
I guess I'll reverse start, unless, John, do you want to?
No, we don't have to go in order. It's not.
We'll just be methodical about it. I guess I would say it's already happening, right? And if we don't catch up, to my other point, that we will be surprised what will be demanded of us as educators. And I think if you think about it, back to my other point, it just doesn't make any sense the way we do it, other than that was the only way we could do the education at the time. So as students come to school with more tools to learn, if we can't adapt to them, I think they're just going to continue to push and push and push on all of us to do that. And I remarked, though, it's not just the students, right? So I'm not that old, but I'm old enough that the new teachers we have in our schools weren't born when I was their age, which I hate. bothers me for some reason. But what's remarkable about them is we designed a model where teachers teach in quite a different way. They actually teach in teams. They're led by a master teacher. And I thought, well, that'll really work great, right? So the students will learn, will be more personalized, will deliver the content they need when they need it, and the teachers will work together led by a master teacher. What I didn't realize was how much information we would get and how much learning and how much reinventing we would do led by our younger team members, right? Because they know so much more about technology than some of us who have been around a little bit longer. So I think it's really remarkable that both in the way students will push all of us, and frankly, I think the way our younger employees will push all of us, that we better, in some ways, just get out of the way a little bit, but also be prepared for what they're going to demand of us.
Totally agree. This own learning, we think of it as own content. And being in the content business, again, one could presume perhaps we think all the content should be ours. On the contrary, we actually embrace the leverage and extend universe of content. So,
Get that in writing?
Absolutely. Press hard 3 times. Because that's, look, what technology allows for in the bring your own content world is a sort and sequence of that. But just like the technology conversation we just had, it puts additional pressures on the people who actually have to deliver that content in a non-sequenced kind of way. And what's the professional development for them to actually embrace an environment where some of the content will be classic pedagogically ordered content and some of it will be open sourced or crowdsourced content, and how do they teach in that environment? I think that's an important professional development issue.
I guess I would say that this all comes down to what really is the role of the teacher going forward. So what I would say is I think that the last 40 years have been a really miserable experiment. We tried to turn teachers into the skill business by getting really accountable and making sure that they can teach second grade 2-digit addition and things like that. And in the process, you know, they had to divert their time from teaching kids and actually getting to know their children. And I think that, you know, when you talk about kids being able to learn directly, what they're really going to learn mostly are skills and things like that, right? When you go on a MOOC, you don't really learn how to collaborate or interact or anything like that. So I think that my hope is that we start to really rethink what teachers do for a living, and at least the teachers I talk to didn't actually become teachers to get in the skill business. You know, there was nothing exciting about the 80 hours of 2-digit addition in second grade for them. It was, they wanted to connect with kids, they wanted to teach them values, how to learn how to think. And I think that once we get them back out of the skill business, and I do think personalized learning is going to help teachers get out of the skill business and into the kid business again. I think once they're back in the kid business, we're going to see schools start to work in the way that we want to see them, where they're building the non-cognitive, non-skill-based things that children need to be successful in life. And so I really think getting that rule pulled apart from skills and kids and making great people, that's the future once kids can learn the skills directly online.
Let me, we won't do this back and forth thing all morning here, and we should stop this. I want to emphasize the point about the public policy, because what my colleagues here have been saying about the opportunities that technology presents and about the changing role of teachers, all of these things are true, and all of these things will inevitably drive change. However, they're driving change in a context that is established by our policymakers, and in particular by our state policymakers. I want to give you a statistic that startled me when we've been doing some research on how policy can shape or fail to shape or encourage or discourage the development of technology and other kinds of innovations. Over the last decade, as states have been trying to deal with technology and accountability and all of these other things, the states have adopted very different policies applying to everything under the sun with respect to education. And over the last decade, some states have made enormous progress academically, and other states have been literally stuck in the mud or even slipping backwards. And over the last decade, the difference in improvement using NAEP as a measure in 4th and 8th grade reading and math, the difference between the most improved states and the least improved states is about a year and a half worth of achievement. about a year and a half worth of achievement. And that is not because of demographics, it's not because of family factors, it's because of the policies that the states are making. And right now, the states have very different policies with respect to technology and online learning. If you take a look at digital learning now, they recommend a host of policies that states ought to adopt to create a more liberal environment, a more progressive, open environment for technology. And some states have adopted 75% of the recommendations, and others have adopted 15 or 20%. Policymakers are trying to figure out how to facilitate technology in a responsible way. Yes, there's resistance and political pressure and all of that, but they're trying to figure out whether they should give high school students the right to take a course if they're online, if their school or district objects. They're trying to decide when credit should be appropriately awarded and when that would be a bogus thing to do. So these decisions that are being made in state houses right now have enormous influence, and it's why you see technology taking off in some states and not in others. So I think that for the business and the education of technology to move forward rapidly, we have to pay more attention to what the right policies need to be so the policymakers know what to do.
Hey, John, can I push back on that? Because I promised everyone I said I'd do this that we'd get some flamethrowers going a little bit. So I don't disagree that we need to work on policy, but I'm so sick and tired of policy. I can't stand it. I'm just sick of listening to adults talk about how they're going to fix the problem and watch what's happened over the past 40 years. I mean, we work in New Jersey, right? And spend $20,000 per kid. $20,000 per kid. And do you know how much better the system has gotten over time in Newark? None. So I think I agree. I'd love to see policy move forward, but I decided that we would take a really different tack from this. And I got the idea from Danner, who said at some point, we're going to serve 1 million kids at Rocketship. And I thought, what? That guy's out of his mind. What an ego. But after I thought a little bit, what John, I think, was saying is that the only way we're really going to see change is to reach out to students and parents and build a market and build a product that they want. So part of this shove, John, I guess, for me as a person who's actually running schools, right, and doing this work, is that we're trying to create the systems and the way of operating that if we can have 500 of these schools in 7 years, we'll have 500. And people say, well, that's crazy. How could you possibly do that? And I get it. It's not selling hamburgers or making coffee, but there are a lot of things to be learned from selling hamburgers and making coffee that we don't apply to education because we wait for adults to decide what to do. And I mean, if I have one more policymaker in my building who, walks around and looks at it and tells me what they think, and then I know they're going to go away, and it's going to be 3 more years of research and reports and election cycles. And so we're just trying to push past and through that to get to parents and families and see if you had the right tool in place for them, would they buy it? So.
Maybe
I'm
just
off my soapbox.
No, it's a good soapbox. Get back on. Hashtag sick of policy. So I think that was the Twitter handle. But
just attribute it to John Danner, maybe.
let's build on this because I think this is a real tension point that I'm seeing in sort of the digital learning space at large, with funders, with folks trying out new models, and it's what are the biggest impediments to launching these next generation models? Is it policy, or is policy just a distraction? Is it union contracts? Is it local capacity? Is it folks that at the local level that want to do this but just don't know how? What is, we all sort of agree that technology can transform the system, so why hasn't it? What's holding it back?
Well, other than it's hard and complex, I think there's a lack of standards, right? So I don't know if it's a flip coin of policy, but I think the lack of standards on technology and technology platforms is an opportunity.
So technical standards.
Technical standards.
Okay.
From a data
Interoperability.
consistency and persistence to the implementation of said technologies. I mean, I think that's a big gating factor. And whether that's solved through policy or not, it's a fair question. I don't know. But,
I mean, sometimes it's just flat out prohibitions. So there are places where you can't open online charter schools, or there's places where online charter schools are funded at levels that makes them uneconomical, and so those states just will not have them. There's places where students are allowed to take courses at their discretion online. There are most places where that's strictly up to the school district. And then when you get into school districts, I mean, Ben, it's very different when you're outside of a school district. But within a school district, if you decide that you want to implement a technology initiative in some substantial way, unless the taxpayers are throwing a lot more money in to pay for it, you have to figure out how to pay for it. And if the idea is that students are going to work a little bit more online and a little bit less with teachers in some combination, well, then you have a major labor issue. And, I mean, those are the harsh realities.
John, any thoughts? You kind of intersected in sort of both levels with going into districts, you have policy with states, and you
Yeah.
also have sort of capacity issues too as you're trying to scale.
I don't want to be too simplistic because I lived the last 10 years in the policy world, so I understand all those things. But really, I think that fundamentally education kind of marches based on teachers and what teachers want, their unions want. And so, you know, we're not wise to ignore this issue of what teachers feel about all of this, right? So today, the way a teacher feels is threatened by and large by the idea that this stuff is going to take away their job. And I want to relate a story that a friend of mine told me about when digitization came to Hollywood. So if you remember, about 15 years ago, digital editing tools came into Hollywood, Avid and things like that, and this guy was kind of the front-end business development guy for Avid, and so he spent most of his time with the video editors with the film editors in Hollywood. And when he introduced the system to them, he said, "Yeah, you know, you don't need to do what you've been doing before with the cutting of the tape and the cutting of the film and the taping and stuff like that." And they said, "You don't understand. That's when the principal or when the director or the producer comes in. That's how they know we're working. I mean, you're taking away our job." And he had to convince them. It took him about 2 years to convince them that, in fact, their job was composing scenes, not, you know, cutting film and taping it. And I think we're in a little bit of that same existential crisis with teachers right now, where I really don't imagine people look back in 10 years and say, "God, I really miss teaching those basic skills. That was just the best part of my life." But they're scared to death that if you take that out, what do I have? Because we have a whole generation of teachers that have lived in the skills and accountability world, and so it's really unknown to them what kind of a great whole class environment with project-based learning and all the things that you use to help kids actually learn things is like. And so I think we really need to deal with this root cause of kind of how does a teacher feel about this change that's happening, because otherwise I don't think the institutions will move.
You know, maybe just building off of that question, sort of in terms of teachers feeling threatened, you know, those words of threatened and fear, you know, I hear that a lot as you see these sort of models. You see existing sort of incumbent traditional models feeling threatened by new models, whether it's losing kids, losing funding, teachers, you know, sort of hopeful in one sense that this may be the solution that helps them, you know, experience the teaching that they got into teaching for, but also fearful of what, Dana, you were just saying about, you know, what it might mean. You have sort of like these paradigm changes that I think are scary with policymakers. I was on a call last night with some state legislators who just couldn't wrap their models around sort of blended learning charters, and kind of like, because it looks so different from what they've grown up with and what they've seen every time they visit a school, you know, 3 or 4 times each year or more. So how is that playing out in terms of your all's experiences of fears? One other fear I just want to put on the table too, which is this notion of private companies, no matter how well-intentioned they are with trying to solve solutions to educator problems and student problems, but this sort of tension that I think we're seeing, and Diane Ravitch is sort of flaming about sort of private companies coming into education and making profit off of kids and experimenting with kids, and that seems to be a fear that is out there, at least with a segment. And is that like a growing segment, or is that something that is just, you know, always an isolated minority? But just maybe just comments generally on sort of fears and people feeling threatened.
I spent a large part of my career on the bleeding edge of business and education, having been one of the founders of Edison Schools, which is sort of one of the more toxic brands in the history of business involvement in education. But Edison was scary because we weren't just selling textbooks or software. We were doing the bread and butter work of the public schools, sometimes through charter schools, sometimes through partnerships with school districts. And so we were vilified by the public school establishment, not because we might harm children, but because we might be successful. That was the fear. There is within public education and within some circles a demonization of business, and some of that's really just about hardball politics. Teachers have legitimate fears, as this John said, have legitimate fears about the future, but those fears get fanned as part of the hardball politics. But there are these biases. There are the fierce opposition based on interest, and there's no getting around that. I do think with technology it's likely to be different. And the reason I say that is that nobody in education really believes that a not-for-profit, and I've spent a lot of time with not-for-profits, no offense, nobody thinks that a not-for-profit is going to raise the capital to develop the technology or to develop the software. Everybody believes that business is going to be part of this. And I think that that's different. It's automatically a more legitimate role. So I think that while there's the hardball politics in the background, this is a process of people beginning to get comfortable with what blended learning looks like, getting comfortable with the idea that this is a process of transition. Yes, 20 years from now, there may be fewer teachers in the system, but with the attrition that we have of teachers, no actual teacher is going to lose a job. This is about a slow transformation of a system, not something that's going to cause layoffs and those sorts of things.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add, although I'd say, we fundamentally think about this all the time in running a school that's in a blended environment, that change is just scary. It doesn't matter what the change is, that any kind of change is very difficult for people to undertake. So what we try to do is embrace that fact and say it's okay. And I know that sounds like pie in the sky and all that, but that seems to be the place where we have the most success in talking about anything that makes us fearful. Though I guess the biggest comment I want to make about fear is the one thing I don't see a lot of fear is in the eyes of students. They love the idea of personalizing their learning experience, and they don't know that they'd even use the word blending, but the idea of not sitting in a class of 30 students getting a lesson that I either don't understand or already knew or whatever, and yet having something more dynamic happening, and then I can begin to own it and have some kind of personalization environment with it, really makes a lot of sense. So that's the part, while I think there is a lot of fear on the adults' side, that the students, and in many respects, the parents, just don't seem to have as much. They are just so excited about this. And we barely understand what we're doing. Now that said, we're getting tremendous results so far, but we're just getting going. But we see parents and students just hungry for anything other than what they have. I mean, and we can say we've done better and technology's making improvements, but we've got a long way to go.
Ben, how about just one question, just follow up for you there, because I know you're in Newark, right?
Yep.
And so I know the Zuckerberg gift, was initially sort of celebrated, and sort of a lot of community sort of expressions of distrust or sort of concerns about it. And to your point, some of the changes that are trying to be made in Newark, you see a lot of sort of parents and families expressing a little concern, and I think you see this in a lot of urban areas. Like, have you sensed that same sort of concern with your model, or if not, how have you avoided that in terms of getting sort of parent buy-in and trust?
Yes, we still see the same thing, although I would say that has really been, certainly in Newark's case, it's been tremendous to have the support that's there from funders and philanthropists, including the Facebook folks, and others as well. But more of that has been just the change in dynamic from private, sort of even not-for-profit folks, charter operators, versus more districts. So I'd say it's still primarily driven there, but we definitely face that. What I guess what I was saying in my comment before, though, is we see that barrier come down so quickly. I mean, we have definitely had parents come in our school and go, what are you doing? Right? That's crazy. And then they talk to their child about it, or they spend 10 or 15 more minutes watching, and the barrier really quickly comes down. They totally get what we're trying to accomplish.
Great.
I think the element he brought up that's really instructive is obviously there's a fear with some teachers and administrators, but it's the parent issue that I think is particularly interesting in this one. where I disagree a little bit. I agree with you that there's no fear at through the student's eyes, but we actually see a lot of fear through the parents' eyes. And what does all this mean? What does Common Core state standards mean? How do I adopt it? How do I help my student? Technology, what device should I buy? So there's a lot of, if not fear, maybe fear is the wrong adjective, but a lot of questions about what's my role in this new emerging learning environment on behalf of my student, and how do I help? So that intermediary, I think, is an important landscape to consider for sure.
I just want to make one suggestion, because John Chubb said something that I think is really right. The problem, the reason that this becomes political is that the technology companies think their customers are schools, right? So if you want to sell to a school and make money from a school, that means that it's got to get in a budget somewhere, and then that puts it into the political arena. I would suggest that given the very tiny number of dollars available there, given the fact that HMH, Pearson, et cetera, will crush you if you try to get into the state-adopted game, the idea that you should charge schools for your product is like squeezing blood out of a rock. It's just a dumb idea. And I think that, obviously many of the people in this room have been doing that for a long time. But now that we have consumers, now that people are actually online, you should really think about the trade there, because really schools are one of the worst single customers probably of any industry anywhere. And so really starting to think now that people are online, what do you do to work with schools, but in order to get to your true customers? Because one of the big problems with technology is alignment. Schools have a variety of interests and issues. I ran a school system. I know what all of ours were. They weren't all about student learning. I think Rocketship was slightly more aligned with that than most, but still they weren't all about student learning. But when you go to a parent and a student, if you can actually get their attention, which is always the hard part, you've got pretty good alignment. Student wants to learn, parent wants them to learn, et cetera. And so the real question is, how do you stop this political battle of trying to charge schools money? They don't have any, and anybody who thinks once textbooks go away, then that money's going to get reallocated to technology has not been around public education long enough. That is not where the money's going to go. So I think that we really need to think about how the business model's changed now that the world has changed. So it's not just kind of the school systems, it's us in this room trying to figure out how to work with school systems and consumers that need to rethink that.
Well, I guess I would say that given that of all the money spent on education and learning, the less than, what's the figure, 1 or 2% spent on content is not an overreach and spending too much on it. Perhaps that was not your point. But I think I would take the position that content matters. We wouldn't take the position that only HMH content matters, but quality content certainly matters. If not, why create it? And I certainly agree with John's comment earlier that let's not kid ourselves. It costs a lot of money to create content, and if we think nonprofits are going to create that, then we're fooling ourselves. So, look, to me, 1 or 2% of investment on content and on behalf of changing the learning landscape is not asking for too much. In fact, if anything, we're probably underinvested in that perspective. Now, you've got to have an equal and commensurate investment on the professional development side, as I said this afternoon. But I guess I don't believe that all content's created equal.
How do we, maybe that's a good question. How do you know quality? This is for the panel. Just, these new models, what's the best metrics to use to sort of gauge quality content? I think about over the last couple of years, you just had an explosion of content. Professionally sort of created content. You had OER created content, teacher created content. I mean, there's thousands of lessons, videos, other things out there. How do you know quality when you see it, when it's content, but then also extend that into sort of courses and then also models? Because I think there's a rich sort of dialogue right now. Are the old ways that we hold schools accountable sufficient for these new models? Or are those accountability systems actually getting in the way of these new models? Do we need to be putting more emphasis on growth? Are things like the Common Core really a game changer, or is that a distraction too? But how do you gauge quality in this space?
Well, I think you've asked one of the right questions. How do you measure quality and content? So I think efficacy is one of those ways, but not the only way. And I think one of the promises of technology is going to give us different ways to measure not only outcomes, but intermediary milestones on the learning process and where people may be falling down. So I'm all for measurement of quality and quality content. Look, we all know that great content in bad hands is going to make for, you know, a bad recipe. I mean, yeah, you can give me a cookbook all day long, I'm not going to cook you a great meal. You can give a great teacher mediocre content, and they're going to have a great outcome. So the fact of the most important piece in the value chain is the teacher is not lost on us. But measuring the efficacy of the content, I think the promise of technology, one of the exciting things for us is on getting a little fact-based discussions with respect to the efficacy of content.
So I'd add, we have a bunch of 12 and 13-year-olds who'd be happy to evaluate any content you'd like for you. And you'll pretty quickly get a sense of whether it's any good or not. And I joke, but it's really powerful to watch a child interact with content and see what happens, right? And you'll pretty quickly get a sense of whether or not you've got a quality piece of content, whether or not it can get to students where they are. But obviously, I think the second piece, though, is the relationship between the quality of the content and the outcomes you produce using it and tools. And so some of that is clearly teacher-driven. But I think the better we could do, right, if we could have good teachers with great content, we know we're going to get better results. So I think, obviously, you want to look at outcomes, whatever you decide those outcomes are. And I think, you know, one of the things I wanted to also throw into this piece of the equation, though, John, is that one of the things you see when we start to talk about blending school is, right, so I've been, you know, just wandering around. I don't know many people here, and I certainly don't know the space of investing or creating companies to transform the technology around education, but we use it all the time, and we feel our pain points, and most of you aren't meeting our pain points. It's so bad, we go and create our own content. Sorry. And it's so bad that we build our own data warehouses because we can't find anybody else to do it with the way we want it, or we can't get content providers to give us the data we want. So that's frustrating for me, and I think one of the things that I guess I'd like to suggest is that we have to stop thinking about, I mean, last night, right, the panel I was listening to, we were judging the success of an ed tech company by how much revenue growth it had. I get it. I got it, right? I used to be a business person as well. But Deborah said that one of the themes was return on education, not return on investment, right? So if we're going to rethink what school looks like, you're going to have to maybe break out of the mindset of selling to big school districts or figuring out how to have, you know, immediate banks on revenue when most people don't even understand why you're asking to change what school looks like. You know, to stop teaching to groups of kids and come up with, instead of curriculum that's still designed on a 55-minute lesson, to little nuggets of stuff, YouTube videos and links to information and website links and short videos, that kind of thing. That's the pain point we're feeling, is that people are not building for rethinking what school looks like. So we think that there's real opportunity there. I don't know if it's as big as selling to, you know, the 25 largest school districts in the country. I got that. But if we're trying to reinvent school, there's a piece there to be thought about, like what would school look like, and then building the tools towards that.
And I think we want to be careful about just saying the word content, because, you know, content in its traditional form, which are tools for students to use with kids, that's a certain thing. Online learning, to me, is a very different thing, and I think that there are kind of two paths we seem to be going down right now. There are the folks like Greenbox or ST Math that really do seem to get the kids that we had at Rocketship, or Ben has at Touchstone, the other 99% of kids, the kids who, you know, you just say, hey, it's all student directed, have fun, and they're like, dude, what do I do now? I mean, you know, you don't, it sounds like an overgeneralization, but, you know, come to our schools and watch kids who don't necessarily have kind of the success and self-esteem in life, and just throw them into the abyss of online learning and hope they make their way out. That is not a recipe for success. So, you know, I think that one of the most positive pieces of news in online learning was Udacity being willing to work with San Jose State, you know, and when I saw that announcement, I thought, okay, now you got my kids. And you know, you should go see that because they are learning a ton as a company about how the other 99% learns right now, and I think that's going to benefit them a lot. So I think that what we really need to realize is that 1% of kids who already went through the system successfully is not the target market. It's the rest of the world. It's the other, you know, 1.98 billion that didn't go through the system successfully, that do live in countries that don't even have schools. How do you serve them and give them the right kind of support in a system? And one thing that I think about a lot in those systems is motivation. You know, that's a big difference between different kinds of kids. If you can build a system that creates intrinsic and extrinsic motivation for kids, you really get it right. And I have to say, online learning has been terrible at intrinsic motivation. You know, intrinsic motivation basically means you are solving a problem you want to solve, that you are capable of solving. When you solve it, you get, you know, positive congratulations and rewards for that. Like, watch these systems. You almost never are solving the right problem, and when you do, it doesn't do much for you. So I think that, you know, we just need to get really serious here. If you're going to help the other 99% of kids, you've got to have systems that help them get motivated, because your stuff could be great, but if they don't want to use it, who cares? And so now we're moving out of the world of like, well, I'd rather play on a computer than listen to a teacher, so I'll do that, and into the real world, which is, I've got a lot of choices as a kid. What do I want to do? Well, you got to figure out a way that they want to do your stuff. So I think that's going to be really positive for online learning.
Just want to add one thing, and that is, John mentioned the Common Core assessments. If you look at the progress of the various states over the last decade, the states that have made the most progress are the ones that had standards that were actually demanding that students think and solve problems, that weren't basic skills kinds of standards, and had assessments that linked up with that. The promise of the Common Core is that now virtually all of the states will have standards that demand deeper learning and more problem solving, and that will have assessments that push students and teachers towards those higher kinds of that higher kind of learning, and then technology can facilitate that. The first assessments are going to be administered across all the states in 2014, 2015. The cut points are yet to be set. The assessments are yet to be settled upon. And you know, it remains to be seen whether the states are really willing to embrace expectations for kids and teachers that raise the bar. If they're not, then technology and other kinds of content are going to be driven kind of back to the basics, and we're not going to get anywhere. If the bar is actually raised, then I think that creates much more of an impetus for technological innovation, other kinds of content innovation. But at this point, we just have to wait and see. We don't know how that's going to come out.
You know, I think we're going to move to questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. We have someone with a roving mic. And as we have the mics coming up, just one question for the panel, because it sort of builds a little bit on John's last comment about the Common Core assessments. You know, for them to be delivered on time, on schedule, and with the enhanced features, schools need sort of a robust broadband and device environment. And I was sort of struck when we were talking about some of the challenges, no one really sort of mentioned technology infrastructure, broadband, devices. Is that a problem, or is that something that you see schools on a trajectory that it's going to solve itself in time for the assessments and for the type of learning that you're delivering? I'm just kind of curious, and then we'll go to some questions here. So just one or two.
Just my take on that. Certainly huge infrastructure costs for existing organizations, but as somebody who started anew, really technology is becoming cheap, right? It's just remarkable. The cost of the device, you know, a Google Chromebook is now $200, maybe $250. From a $1,000, $1,500 laptop, all wireless. You don't need to wire your buildings anymore. You don't even need phone lines. So I think we see really dramatic progress, even in our little organization, growing to what that looks like. And I can't even imagine how quickly that's going to change. You know, and the story I use is think about what telephone costs were for each of us 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, and now we Skype and FaceTime, and it doesn't cost us a thing. I mean, there are different cost structures about what that looks like. So we see technology really moving quickly. I recognize, though, that existing organizations have these huge legacy costs to overcome, and it is not insignificant. But I think looking forward, the possibilities are pretty remarkable.
Maybe any other?
No, I would agree. I think we need some of our partners in this ecosystem, the mobile carriers and technology partners, to rethink their business models about how they participate in addressing this issue. Because they're not priced to help solve this problem per se. They're priced on a commercial basis, so they really need to rethink their business model for this piece.
Great. We have a question with Giselle.
Going back to what John Danner said about, you know, how teachers are afraid of using technology, or the change is always very difficult. There are some examples in Oakland, in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, where teachers, you know, in a district who are the same kind of teachers who were there 10 years ago, embraced this. They were volunteers. So unlike other, you know, like charter schools were meant to be models that were going to be emulated by district schools, and we're going to get a huge, you know, change. in the way education was delivered in this country. That really hasn't happened, and it doesn't look like it ever will. I mean, we have about 6,000 charter schools after 20 years. If all you guys, you know, double yourselves in another 10 years, you still haven't made a dent in, you know, the 100,000 schools that are operating in this country. But my question is, how do you feel about building demand in the teacher, among teachers? Because forget about the unions. When teachers like the ones that I referred to in the districts that are working, who make their own videos, just absolutely saying, this changed my life, I'm now doing what I really wanted to do. If you work with the willing, and you can convince, you can build enough demand among teachers per se, do you think that would be transformational in a faster way than anything we've seen in terms of reforms before?
I certainly think it's going to be grassroots. I mean, I think that if you go down the kind of policy political route, it works at its own speed, and you know we'll see kind of decade as the unit of measure. So I definitely think that teachers adopting tools and personally experiencing them, using them to change the way that they teach is the way that change is going to happen. I think that the biggest barrier I've seen to that is that, you know, teachers don't have a lot of money personally, so us trying to charge them X dollars per kid or whatever may make some business sense, but it's not actually the way this type of adoption works. You know, you've got to get it into the people's hands, and they've got to use it, and once they use it, they can become evangelists for you, and that can change. So I think that if we take the tack that one of the focuses for any business or as the industry in general is to get tools into the hands of teachers where they can become evangelists and a positive force in this, then we'll start to move it in the right direction. I hear much more from teachers kind of, geez, this technology stuff, all these companies, they're shoving stuff down on us, et cetera. I think that's the exact recipe for kind of resistance in a much more drawn out cycle.
I think this is also a place where a little education leadership would help. Right now, nationwide, the thing that teachers are most aware of is that their performance is being measured with value-added assessments, that their performance is being measured with validated observational tools of good instruction, and that new evaluation models that are 50% observation and 50% value-added test scores, that's their life. And that's happening everywhere. 5 years ago, it was nowhere. But this is something that the reform community decided was a good idea. This is something that the administration decided was a good idea, and it's been pushed. And so teachers feel even more put upon now than ever. A state leader, a district leader could say, you know, wherever we are in that, we're going to have a major initiative with blended learning, and we're going to show how your life can actually be easier. But, you know, where is that leadership?
It's a great question.
Hi, this is Rahul from Appriso. I saw 2 points mentioned here. One was selling to school districts and schools as one go-to-market, and the other one selling to parents and kids. Now, let's assume that you have managed to sell to the parents and kids, and how much of that influences a school's decision to buy that solution, according to your experience, and also how does selling to teachers influence schools, school districts' ability or willingness to buy that solution?
Question. You want to go first?
You go first.
It's a great question. I mean, I think when I was listening to John make that comment, I think the point is that to make a larger group of evangelists for yourself for doing this work, the more that parents, students, and teachers touch this stuff, the more likely you're going to get that versus a decision maker in a big bureaucracy. It's a really different thing. That said, I mean, what we're really looking for is content as a school that aligns to the outcomes we want to achieve. That said, one of the things we really look at is the quality of the interaction between the adults using the content, the teachers, and the learners. So we look to see how well it's doing, but we definitely change out content all the time when we see a better experience going on between the students and the teachers. And it's one of the reasons we're completely open. And we welcome you. You're welcome to Newark anytime. If you're trying to make something work for school, we'll let our kids mess around with it. We'll let you see what we're doing so you can see it in action versus just trying to dream it up in a lab, because so much of it has not done that. So I hope that helps. It's a good question, though.
Just from our perspective, we don't look at marketing to the parents and students as pull-through of our content, because only a third to 50% of any given district uses our content. So we're trying to market to the broad piece that's looking to complement or supplement their child's education experience, either because they're behind or they're ahead, or they just want a different experience. So I don't think we do it first and foremost with the outcome of, geez, we hope that parent calls up the school district and says, why aren't you implementing Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's reading program? That's not really our objective, and I mean that in the most sincere terms. It's certainly to try to monetize that relationship, but to monetize it not through a pull-through of other content, but to help a parent who's interested in supplementing their child's learning experience.
And I would say that this connection between parents and teachers should not be underestimated. I, as a parent, anytime a teacher says, let's look at what's going on with your child, you should really try this, I always try it. I mean, as a parent, that's what you do. So if you start on that end where the teacher has the tool and they say, hey, you really should try this, you're going to try it. It's a lot like your doctor. I mean, doctors prescribe medicine as opposed to recommend medicine, but it's very similar. Why do the pharmaceutical companies give them free samples? I mean, it's just obvious that you have an extremely influential person who can basically drive the market, yet for some reason it hasn't been organized that way yet.
Yep, totally agree with that, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting. We just did at the foundation some focus groups and survey research with teachers and parents to try to figure out with Common Core sort of communication, and that's key. The parents get most of their information about reforms not from the news but from teachers. Yeah. So it's the lens through which teachers see the reforms, whether that's No Child Left Behind, ESEA waivers, teacher evals, Common Core. Blended learning ends up being the main filter that parents. So it's that connections. Yep. Now, one last question for the panel, just rapid fire, then we're going to wrap up. But what has you we talked a lot about change, we talked a lot about some of the challenges, the fears, but what has you most excited when you look out over the next 5-year horizon? Just one sentence, most excited. So maybe, I hope you're excited. Is there something that excites you?
I'll start. Let me stretch it from 5 years to 7 years. Over 7 years, there are going to be 2 billion connected students in the world. And most of those weren't even in schools before, much less connected to the internet. So I think that's an enormous change.
Yeah, I think the most rapid change is happening in colleges and universities. And what constitutes a college education and how that college education is obtained and what are the modalities for instruction. And I think the change there will help to drive change in high schools and then on down the line. And in higher education, it's obvious that it's very dynamic, and I think that will help drive change in K-12.
Well, I think like every other industry, the transformation of this one, and I do agree with John on this point, is going to be from the bottoms up. So the exciting thing to me is actually finding out what this demand from the bottoms up actually is and trying to solve for it, rather than the tops down approach, this is what you need and why. So to me, that's kind of the exciting part of this industry.
I think what excites me most is how quickly tipping points happen now with the more openness of the world, including in our space. So I think in 5 years, I'm not sure I can even envision what school could look like or what the technology around it could look like. And that really is exciting to me to think about how different it could be.
Can you join me in thanking our Johns and our Ben?